back to another Q&A, and as you can see, Finn is already helping. Aren't you, darling? And I have a crab on my lap. There you go. You just go lie down. Go lie down, and Mummy's going to do a Q&A. So we have a few more questions for you today, that have been submitted through the DMs and through the question box link. I have a permanent question box that is open to receiving questions all the time. It is in the description box, so please, if you have a question that you want discussed in more detail, please do feel free to submit it and it will be featured in one of these little Q&A sessions. Okay, so the first question that I got is, I find that I get obsessed with certain foods and just want to eat them all the time. Is this healthy/normal? And the answer to this is yes, it is absolutely fine. It's absolutely normal. And we see this a lot in people who have previously been quite restrictive in their dietary intake. Maybe they've cut foods out, and maybe they've restricted entire food groups, like maybe they've tried to cut carbs or go on a low-fat diet or been paleo or keto or whatever else. And then you reintroduce these foods and you get unconditional permission to eat. And we actually see this quite a lot in eating disorder recovery populations. There's quite a lot of studies in this, like hyperfixation on specific foods. And you basically kind of just have to eat your way through it, and it's absolutely fine. So, for example, I worked with someone previously who just went through a phase of Weetabix, and it was the most random of foods, and you'll probably find yourself doing it. And I think it's part of our normal life cycle of nutrition, is that we find foods that we really, really like. We eat them until we're not bothered about them anymore, and then we move on to something else. Kind of like when Beyonce releases a new song and then you listen to it to absolute death, and then you hate it, and then you move on to something else, like you move on to Taylor Swift's new song. So it's absolutely fine. Similar to the question that we got last week around breakfast, if you haven't watched that episode, go back and watch the previous Q&A episode. It's fine to eat the same breakfast every single day. If you are getting to the point of eating the same foods every day, in the sense of you're eating the same meals every day, that's when we probably need to look at the motives behind it. But when you start reintroducing unconditional permission to eat and start reintroducing some foods, it's so normal to go through phases of being absolutely obsessed with certain foods and just wanting to eat them for every meal. Do apply a little bit of common sense with this. It's probably not helpful to eat Cocoa Pops for every single meal, and we need to get some nutrient variety and some protein and some micronutrients in there. But you can absolutely have Cocoa Pops every morning for breakfast and for your snack if you want to, and you'll find that you'll probably get to a point where you're like, you know what, I'm good now, I can probably take or leave these. But it's kind of just part of refamiliarizing yourself with the food and letting the novelty wear off. Okay, the second question I got was, how can I easily hit a protein target in a calorie deficit? And this is a great question. And my first thought and first comment would be, what is your protein target? And are you trying to hit an excessive amount of protein? Because there's no point discussing how to help you hit an unrealistic protein target. So go back and look at your protein. What level of protein are you aiming to hit? And if you've used the Fat Loss Handbook to work this out, I'm hoping that you've fallen somewhere between the 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram. And I'm assuming, as most people do, because #diet culture, you've probably tried to put yourself at the top end of that spectrum, so closer to the 2 grams per kilogram, because you probably heard on the internet that is better. That's the best thing to do. And if you are struggling to hit that, it's probably worth just tapering it down a little bit. Come down to like 1.5, 1.6 grams per kilo. Get used to hitting that first and then increase it a little bit if you want. But what we don't want to do, especially when you're in a deficit, is start sacrificing other nutrients for protein. So go back and go, right, is this protein target A, realistic, and B, is it actually healthy and helpful? Or does it mean that I'm having to sacrifice loads of carbohydrates and loads of fats? If your fats are at less than 25% of your total energy intake, so if you work out how many calories you're eating and then divide that by 4 and then divide that by 9, I know, confusing. This is all in the Fat Loss Handbook. But if 25% of your energy intake isn't coming from fats, and it's lower than that, then you need to go back and readdress and probably sacrifice some protein. And if your carbohydrates are ridiculously low, like if your carbohydrates you've worked out at less than 100 grams per day, even to some extent, if you've worked it out at being like less than 120 to 150 grams per day, you probably need to go back, reassess, sacrifice a bit of protein and give some more calories to carbohydrates and fat. But in terms of like practicalities of hitting a protein target, the first thing to look at is your meals and look at, do I have some protein in my breakfast? Do I have some protein at lunch? Do I have some protein at dinner? And if you have protein in all three of those, fantastic. If not, go back and reassess and go, is it feasible to add some protein to any of those meals that are missing it? And then we need to look at the quantity of protein. If you've got around like 25 to 35, maybe even up to 40 grams of protein in a meal, that's absolutely brilliant. If your meals are a bit on the lacking side of protein, so if you're kind of like 10 to 15 grams, again, go back and go, right, where can I add some protein to this meal? And the most common place that people can add protein is breakfast. And that might mean just like some milk, some yogurt, maybe swapping your like low fat yogurt for a high protein yogurt will really help to boost that up. Potentially considering like having some eggs at breakfast instead of having just some toast. Maybe you have eggs on toast. Whatever it is, just looking at little places where you can increase that. Breakfast tends to be the one as well where people potentially don't particularly want something high in protein, and that's where even having just some milk on your cereal or making your porridge with milk can really help to boost that protein content up and just give you like a few more grams here and there. The second thing that you can do is look to add in either a high protein snack or use a protein supplement. And whey protein supplements are really helpful to use as snacks throughout the day. And one of the great things about protein supplements is that they tend to come in all sorts of delicious flavours. And you might find that you get to your 3 o'clock slump and you can get into the routine of, actually, I have a protein shake at my 3 o'clock slump because it gives me something kind of delicious and tasty to tide me over when I'm starting to get a little bit stomach grumbly. I tried to go tummy and stomach. A little bit tummy grumbly. I'm feeling a little bit like blah, and just want something sweet to pick me up. And while it's not necessarily high in carbohydrates, you get that sweet taste, which is generally what we're looking for. Sorry if you can hear Finn munching on a bone in the background again. He's decided now is the perfect time, right next to the back of my laptop. What else was I going to say about that one? I made a few notes. Oh yeah, so protein snacks, this is where a whey protein supplement can come in, or a protein bar if you have the calories for it. Generally, they're quite high calorie, but you can kind of combine the best of both worlds in protein and a chocolate bar, and you kind of get both anyway. Do be mindful if you're using things like protein bars and protein supplements that if you have IBS, they might not be particularly stomach friendly because they are probably going to contain artificial sweeteners. So do bear that in mind. Otherwise, you can go for high protein things like the mini baby bells. I know a lot of people use those, or the light baby bells. Again, a high protein yogurt or something to that effect, or like a proteiny milkshake. And the third question, why do I crave chocolate? Oh, if I could fix this with the snap of my fingers, I would, but it's unfortunately not that easy. So, a couple of reasons why you might crave chocolate. So, I want to just distinguish here between cravings and hunger. Hunger is a general feeling of my tummy's rumbling, like you've got physiological symptoms of hunger, like actual physical hunger. And restriction is very specific and tends to come on very fast, and you want a very specific thing. So, in this case, it's chocolate. And generally, the research has kind of shown, I was doing a lot of reading about this yesterday, and I'm actually probably going to do a standalone little seminar webinar thing on cravings and how to manage them and why we get them, etc. And the most robust research tends to show that we get cravings from things that we restrict in the short term. So what's probably happening, or what I'm imagining is happening, is you're aiming to diet and you've cut back on eating chocolate. Like you've reduced how much chocolate you're eating. And when we reduce how much chocolate we're eating, it makes us want it more. It's an unhelpful paradox, maybe? Is that the right word? I don't know. But it's an unhelpful phenomenon, is that when we reduce things, our body goes, you want more of that now. And that leads to a craving. So generally, restriction. So the answer to cravings in this sense of if you have a very specific craving for chocolate is that you probably need to eat some chocolate and it's absolutely okay. Interestingly, the research shows that tends to err towards showing that while short-term restriction of specific foods and specific food groups leads to craving of that food or food group, and the more it's kind of restricted, the more intense and the higher frequency that craving is. So if you try and cut out chocolate altogether, you're probably going to experience really intense, really frequent chocolate cravings. But the research also shows that long-term energy restriction, so like a long-term calorie deficit in people who are overweight or obese, does tend to reduce the frequency and intensity of cravings in general. So actually, weight loss is really helpful in reducing cravings. Not entirely sure why, but it does. You might also just be hungry, particularly if you are in a deficit and you are dieting. And the craving for chocolate may be almost like a conditioned Pavlovian response. So, Pavlov's dogs, he rang the bell, they salivated because they'd been conditioned to that cue. You might be conditioned to the cue of like 3 p.m. hunger. And this is when it happens for most people. Chocolate cravings tend to intensify in the afternoon. And you might find that Pavlovian response of you're not actually craving, you're just hungry. But that hunger, you are conditioned to either believe that it's a chocolate craving or to reach for chocolate in that instance to satisfy that hunger. So you identify it as a chocolate craving when actually it's just hunger. You can explore that and go, what would actually happen if I didn't feed myself chocolate in that instance? If I fed myself something else? And do get really curious about this. Go, right, am I hungry? Or is it a genuine craving for something very specific? And if it's like a very generalized craving for like just something sweet, you might have just assumed that craving is for chocolate. So do get curious about it. Try feeding yourself other things in that instance. Try eating a bit more earlier in the day. If you do find yourself starting to crave chocolate at 3 p.m, aim to have a bigger lunch, a mid-morning snack, a slightly bigger a slightly bigger breakfast, a mid-morning snack, a slightly bigger lunch, and see if you can actually get past 3 p.m. without that craving smacking you in the face, and see what happens. Get curious about it, because the only way that we start to understand our bodies is it with a bit of trial and error, with a bit of exploration and curiosity. And also see what happens if you do get that chocolate craving. If you feed it something else, see what happens. And you might go, oh, you know what, actually still craving chocolate. Okay, genuine chocolate craving. But you might find that if you feed yourself something else, that craving goes away. But you can actually be conditioned and learn to crave specific foods, which is actually, really helpful, because it means that we can unlearn how to crave those specific foods. And the way that we can unlearn to crave those is actually by just feeding ourselves different things in that instance, and you uncondition that response. So as always, that hopefully answers your questions. As always, if you have any questions that you'd like discussed in more detail, the link to the question box is in the description. Please feel free to give this a like, a comment, or a share. Share it anywhere that you fancy. Send this to someone who you might find it useful. And I will see you in the next one.